Good evening and welcome to Central Hudson's live discussion about the pathway forward, a blueprint of the key issues our region must address in order to thrive. Pattern for Progress has been a local not-for-profit advocacy and research organization for more than 55 years, aimed at promoting solutions that enhance the growth and vitality of our region. Pattern brings together leaders from 9 counties to collaborate on regional approaches to housing, education, land use, transportation, infrastructure, and government efficiency. Central Hudson, a local business for more than 100 years and a founding member of Pattern, has a vested interest in the region's success. Joining us is Jonathan Drapkin, President and CEO of Hudson Valley Pattern for Progress. Prior to his current role, Jonathan was the Executive Director of the Gary Foundation in Sullivan County, worked for the Koch administration in New York City, and was the Director of the New York City Council Office of Oversight and Investigation. He served as a member of 2 governor's commissions focusing on the restructuring of local government, and currently serves as an executive committee member of the Mid-Hudson Regional Economic Development Council. Jonathan, thank you for joining me today.
Alana, great to be here. Thank you to Central Hudson for giving us the opportunity to talk about the pathway forward.
Our pleasure. Back in 2019, Pattern had released another report, Out of Alignment, and Central Hudson was involved with that report. And that report had focused on major regional issues following the Great Recession. And some of the things, I think key things that were kind of teased out in that report were, stagnant wages and job creation, the cost of K through 12 education in the Mid-Hudson Valley, population decline in the region, among other factors. I think one thing it didn't contemplate was a global pandemic.
That would be correct. As good as I think the staff is, we did not see this one coming.
I don't think most of us did. Does this new report, The Pathway Forward, build on that? And do the things that Pattern found in Out of Alignment still hold true today?
So fair questions. And I think that one of the things that we have to keep in mind is, I think almost every day people look at where they are in their lives and there's this gap, and the gap is the pandemic. It's sort of like how
suspended animation.
It is. It's sort of like you might have thought of BC or AD as we count the calendar. Well, there may be BP, as in before pandemic. So you're asking us to go back to the Out of Alignment report, which we thought was a pretty good assessment of how the region's economy had come out of alignment from the region's demographics. And there were a number of issues that we brought to light there with regard to the cost of education, the cratering of the enrollment, when you project it out to 2028, I think we did in the report, that the enrollment was going to be reduced in 7 of the counties that Pattern works in. We did not look at Westchester and Rockland, which I will say that we took a look at when the census came out, and the reduction in enrollment is actually, has declined, but not as much as the other 7 counties. Is it still valid? Well, so here's what happened. That report was released in October 2019, and for most of us, we kind of count the beginning of the pandemic at the beginning of March 2020. Mm-hmm. If anything, what we pointed out in 2019 has gotten worse.
Okay.
That's not a happy thought, and I think part of our discussion today is to sort of say, where are we, and then what is the pathway forward? Because as a report, I'd much rather say, as we did in Out of Alignment, let's get real about what we're facing, but then let's also have a discussion about what we can do about it.
Right, and I think that's where you're going with the pathway forward, right? So why did Pattern decide to undertake this study?
So I think that because there's this let's say 20-month period where we were on lockdown, we were scared, people are fatigued now. They're tired, and that's not to be underestimated. The mental health of what occurred here with regard to the entire region, let alone New York State or other parts of the country. We felt that it was important to say, well, if we were done, and that's really important because we issued this report in June of 2021, and we might have all been thinking the world was starting to return to normal, in quotes, air quotes for that, and then the Delta variant hit. And we wanted people to begin a dialogue, just like Out of Alignment, which was the most read report that Pattern ever did. We still get comments on it with people saying, is this true? Is this, where we're really at? This is really a report now, the pathway forward, where the board collaborated with our own staff to say, if we were to begin, where would we begin? And we seized upon 4 areas, and they are workforce, housing, Hudson Valley, Main Streets, and then we looked at something we call the Digital Valley. And could there have been others? We've discussed many times our feelings on K through 12 education and where we are, and so much has happened there, and most of it is sad in terms of lost time for education, and how do we begin to repair that?
But I think that factors into workforce, which was the first area that you mentioned. And maybe you could touch on some of the issues that you found when you were studying workforce, and maybe give us a piece of what's in the report on the area of workforce.
So let's start with workforce. Because I think job number 1 is that everyone needs a job, and when you shut down an entire economy and you tell people stay home, you're undoubtedly going to disrupt it, and so you don't just reboot. It's not like pressing some key on your computer and everything comes back to life. So what are some of the issues? So first of all, let's look at the workforce, because the workforce, if you think of a tube for the workforce, and you have inputs, the number of people that are going to work, or potential talent, or where are we going to find people. One of the things we pointed out back in 2019 was it seemed that every sector had help wanted signs. That is 10 times worse now than it was pre-pandemic. So let's go back to the tube. The number of people going in is starting to catch up with us. If we're not growing as a region in terms of population, and especially if we've been writing about this for the past 15 years, the population of K through 12 is declined by almost 25% projected out to 2028. Then your input, if you're not attracting new people to the region, is going to get smaller. So more help wanted on that end. And then on the other end of the tube is that the boomers started to retire. But then following this 20-month ordeal, you have many people who were in a position either because they had enough years in their retirement system, they had enough money built up in their 401k or 403b, that they decided, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I'm burnt out, and I can retire, and they may have been willing to stay in the system. So this is important for we've always referred to the brain drain as the loss of young people from our region who said, I don't want to live here.
Right.
There is actually, what's going on right now are 2 brain drains. There is the brain drain
and the end, right?
At the beginning and the end, Alana. And so that at the beginning, it's sort of the young people that choose not to live here, but now there is this collective knowledge and wisdom of people who have been working 20, 30, 40 years that are saying, we're done. And the workforce is being severely challenged by a number of factors. And so the solutions as to what to do about improving the workforce, equally, there is no magic bullet. There's no silver bullet here. There's no one solution that's going to work.
Because there's no one issue, right? You're saying, I mean, there's maybe a population issue, but maybe there's a mismatch of skills issue too, right? Because it's not as though there's no workers available, but maybe they don't have the right skills. That's another issue. So maybe could you touch on some of what Pattern sees as potential strategies to address some of the workforce issues that we're seeing here in the Valley?
So let's just add one more to the mix, which is that in these 20 months, what happened to our integration of technology in all aspects of our life may have taken 10 years to do, happened in the space of
weeks.
It happened in the space of a little over a year. And that is also stressing the workforce. So what do we need to do? First of all, we need to find bodies. And as I tell all my economic development friends, I would never say to you, stop attracting the next good business here. Mm-hmm. But then if they're here, how do we populate their workforce? And what are some of the solutions? And so clearly, we're going to have to be very creative about this. We're now at a point where automation, where we might have been saying, bad employer, you're automating. There's a certain amount of automation that has to occur if you're just having less kids. Not to want to sound too wonky about this, but there's something called the replacement rate, where there's 2 adults and you need 2 kids to ensure you have a healthy economy. For over 2 decades now, all we've had is 1.7 kids. Now, I don't want to describe what a 0.7 kid looks like, but we're not at that healthy 2.0. And all you need to do is to understand what happened to the Chinese economy when they tried to say 1 kid per family. They had to back off of it because they didn't have enough workers. So automation is going to have to be acceptable at some level for a while. We're going to have to try and look at a new source. And so one of the things that is mentioned in the Pathway Forward is that, and I think I was explaining this to you before we went on air, it's at least our theory that when you look at the census, and this was just confirmed, they just released the 2020 census, that 50% of the residents in the Hudson Valley, their educational attainment is high school plus some courses, not a degree. This is important because I don't believe we spend nearly 50% of our resources trying to get kids from high school to a job. You know, I frivolously refer to it as we should create an Office of Alumni Affairs for every high school. It should be responsible for internships, for bringing back alumni, for really organizing how we intentionally move people from high school to the workforce. We're going to need to do this if that pipeline is so severely affected. I recently saw in the Wall Street Journal an interesting graph, and the graph shows that in the 5 years prior to the pandemic, roughly 6 million jobs nationally are vacant at any given time in a healthy economy. That number now is somewhere between 10 and 11 million. It's not quite double, but it is a staggering number. That requires, I mean, that is the explanation for why you see help wanted signs everywhere you travel in the Hudson Valley. And quite frankly, it's a national problem.
Yeah.
But we're going to have to be far more creative. So a new pipeline from high school, accepting some degree of automation, paying higher wages.
I think we're seeing some of that.
We are,
sure.
and you know, I think we're going to have to accept the fact that higher wages might lead to a real benefit for employers in the sense that every time they hire someone, spend the money to train them, and the person then leaves for a higher paying job, it costs them money. And wouldn't it be better for them if they paid a higher wage, calculated that as part of the training cost, held on to the employees, and therefore could fill positions without seeing as much turnover as we had been seeing pre-pandemic?
So you mentioned that 50% of our kids come out of they graduate from high school. They have some courses at the college level, but we're not really focusing on them enough. Where do you think the community colleges play a role here? Because you look around our region and we have great community colleges. They're very engaged in the communities they serve, in the broader, the workforce. Is there a role for them? Do we need to be thinking about things differently there as we move students from high school to the workforce or high school to college?
So as you move from high school to the community colleges, which are 2-year, they're much more nimble than, let's say, a 4-year school in terms of they can create a certificate course much more quickly so that they can create a cohort of people in healthcare, let's say. The only issue for them is that does every community college in the Hudson Valley have to have the same program?
Right.
It would be better if they were collaborating more, like I know many of them have new RN programs. Mm-hmm. There's a shortage of nurses. It's important to do it. Transportation of getting people from to a job is also an issue of getting people to a community college. To some degree, duplication of courses makes sense because if someone's offering it in Westchester, is someone going to drive from Sullivan or Dutchess all the way down there? But a more cohesive, integrated community college system is necessary because they too are not finding the number of students they need to pay for bricks and mortar and the cost that they incur in the community college. They have faculty that they have to pay for as well. So it's all hands on deck. And to use a very overused word, it's a crisis. You need the community colleges, you need BOCES, you need the workforce investment boards, you need the 4-year colleges all to be collaborating on how do we solve the needs of the workforce in 2021. And that's where the problem of the Delta variant came in. We wrote our report and issued it in June, and then the Delta variant took off, and no, we're not done yet, and we're still not done.
Right.
But we think that this is the time when you're still treading water a little bit. Schools are still worrying about masks. Should we wear them, not wear them? Is everyone vaccinated? Do we need a booster? While that does take tremendous time and effort, it is also an opportunity to rethink what does the workforce look like.
So before we move to the next topic area, we did get a question from Facebook, and I think it's a good question. It's near and dear to Central Hudson's heart. So Melissa Everett, who's from Sustainable Hudson Valley, put in a question about the role for Cleantech and renewable energy going forward. There's a lot happening in the state. Previous Facebook Lives here, we've talked about the energy transition and the goals that the state has set. Did this report contemplate Cleantech's role in New York's future, or do you have any comments on that?
It's not in the report per se, but thank you, Melissa. She's doing a terrific job trying to get to a granular level as to what are the jobs that are going to be needed in green tech. Part of the problem is historical, that there's a group of people that say, you need to convince me. If they've been in workforce going back to 2012, there was a promise of green tech jobs. And the community colleges at that time did in fact say, I'm going to teach this, you'll teach this, you'll teach that. And the jobs didn't materialize. And so I think part of what Melissa is working on and others is defining it much broader. When people think green tech, they think windmills, solar panels. But there is the need to redo housing, and we'll talk more about housing in a minute, but to the degree that housing is energy efficient. So one of the state agencies, NYSERDA, might come down to your house and say, here's what you got to do differently. And you look at it and you say, that's great. I have no idea how to do this. Are there jobs, therefore, for people who can descend upon your house and help translate the current house into one that is more energy efficient? Melissa and others that are working with her are trying very hard to try to be very, very, very detailed in terms of these are the jobs of the future. Do I think we're constructing windmills in the Hudson Valley? I don't. So finding those green tech jobs requires some imagination. So we have enormous, what I call bread and butter infrastructure needs. So that's water, sewer, roads, bridges. But do they all need to be rebuilt thinking about climate change? Many of them do. Route 209 in Ulster County, you can see bridges that have been raised. There are new standards. These are potentially good jobs for laborers to rebuild infrastructure in a way that is cognizant of climate change and also enables us to add new jobs to the workforce. Kind of goes back, though, to a different issue, which is, but where are the workers?
Right.
And we've got to make the jobs attractive enough so that people want to be there, they pay well enough, and that's probably a good place to venture into the next area that we looked at in the report, which is housing.
Sure. So yes, that was the second area. I guess, why don't you give us an overview of what Pattern found when they studied the housing market for the Hudson Valley?
So using out of alignment as a really good baseline, which was what it was intended to do. So pre-pandemic, there was a shortage of affordable housing. And we kind of look at the housing market at three levels, three tiers. So there's affordable for people lower income. There is workforce, hopefully middle class people that need housing. And the third level is at market rate. Pre-pandemic, the amount of supply was already being tested. Post-pandemic, a couple of things happened. There was a surge of people into the Hudson Valley. And by a surge, I think people really do have to understand that we're not talking about 50,000, 100,000.
And some are displacing those that leave.
Exactly.
Right.
So it's not a net gain.
And it might not be a long-term trend, right? It could be temporary.
Well, and it could be because you go back to another issue in workforce, which is remote work.
Right.
So that's some of the people that moved up here because they thought the density in New York City was something that they were concerned about. So they said, wow, I could work up there and I can work remotely. Now that leads to a very interesting discussion, which is, can we attract people from outside the Hudson Valley, from anywhere in the United States, to live here, which is a beautiful place to live? And again, I always want to caution people, I'm not talking about hundreds of thousands, but enough so that there's more people with disposable income that then have an opportunity to spend it on small business, which is one of the four areas in here, so that we do want to attract people from other parts, because now you could live in the Hudson Valley and work almost anywhere. Now, there are some businesses that say their culture is you've got to come back to the office. HR manuals are going to be rewritten for the next 5 years, where people are going to have to say, you have to be in the office, you don't have to be in the office. But on housing, what happened is with that surge, the value of homes skyrocketed. With the value of homes skyrocketing and inventory decreasing, we have yet another crisis on our hand, and that is, where can people live? Now, people often in this equation go, wow, I can make so much money by selling my home. I bought it for $300,000, I can sell it for $500,000, except they've got one problem. Did they think after they sell it, do they have a good plan? If they want to stay in the Hudson Valley, there isn't much inventory. And if they're moving someplace else, not necessarily something we want to see occur, we need workers, we need middle class, we need housing for low income.
But you bring up an interesting point. If you own a home, there's a good opportunity where you can maybe you have more equity in your home, you could sell, go somewhere else. But it also seems like it's a good market signal to build new homes. So, or in all types of housing, are we seeing that? And if we aren't with those market signals, why is that? And what are the policy changes that we need to see regionally? I think that's something you talk about as one of your strategies.
We do, and we did a lot of work in Ulster County on this issue, where we did first housing assessment, and now we're working with them trying to say, well, okay, great, you told us what we need, but then how do we actually implement that? How do we convince the various towns and villages to build?
To allow building.
Yes, and that deals with zoning and planning boards, and it is truly remarkable that people will say, we need more housing, just not where we live. And we are not surprised, but the number of moratoriums or consideration of moratoriums, or the lack of financing for this on the local level, the state is more willing to engage, but we live in a home rule state, so that zoning and planning boards have to be in agreement to say it's okay to add housing. And many people mistake the problem, which is, if we add more housing and you add more supply, well, then that is something that can bring the cost of housing down.
So let me ask
Sure.
a question, and I'll put it in a positive way. Where in the Mid-Hudson Valley, do you see this working? Is there a municipality that you say they've kind of figured this out, they're growing their housing supply across a range of types of housing that maybe others can look to as an example? Does anything come to mind?
Yes. So there are a couple of communities in Dutchess that have been adding more on the market rate side than on the affordable side, and they have been growing them. But the one that really comes to mind is the one that seems to strike us year in and year out, and that is the town of Montgomery in Orange County. Its population keeps growing. Not by enormous strides. It's still a town of about 30,000 people, and yet it keeps growing. And so there are 3 villages and 1 town board that has to approve the housing that occurs there. And obviously, if the population keeps growing, there is some approvals that are going on there. And I encourage people to look there. I've spoken to the town supervisor about this, Brian Marr, several times, and Brian doesn't always have the answer. There are a lot of new jobs in
The area.
Mm-hmm. And that is leading to people wanting to live close by where they're going to work. And there have been units of housing that have been added there. And so Montgomery is a place that I would certainly tell people to look at.
Okay. There are still 2 other areas in the report that we want to touch on. The next is the Digital Valley. That's what Pattern calls it. So tell us what that means in Pattern study, and then what issues did you uncover there? And I'm sure the pandemic colored your perception there and what you found there, I would think.
It absolutely did. Let's face it, during the pandemic, when you're on lockdown and the entire world goes virtual, 3 things in particular occurred. You had telemedicine take a giant leap forward. You had virtual learning for kids in school. Third category, and I know you know this issue all too well, having your own children. And the third one is remote work. Now, there are three areas that clearly we advanced light years, but we didn't advance equitably.
Okay.
There is not full broadband coverage that is affordable for everyone in the Hudson Valley. And you work for a utility company, and I would say it needs to be treated almost like a utility. It is something like you have to have electricity in your house. You have to have reliable broadband if you're low income, if you're wealthy. And the reports that are coming out now are suggesting that New York State is only second to California for the highest percentage of coverage. But even Westchester, 10% of the homes in Westchester do not have broadband. To the people that think of wealthy Westchester, now some of that could be in the cities and low-income people that can't afford it. The digital divide is an expression that's been with us for many years, but it has many new meanings to it. So the boomers age out, they're at home, their ability to navigate technology. There's another job to be created, which is somebody that comes in, you do an energy audit, you do a technology audit, and you have to teach some of the older generation. I'm sitting here saying I'm one of those people that needs help with technology. And so I don't mean that in any disparaging way. The Gen Z was the generation that grew up knowing nothing but the iPhone. For them, and I'll go up to about 35, 40-year-olds, they are technologically very savvy. The ability to work from home, the ability to arrange for a telehealth visit, they were very good. The remote work was a different issue because you had both adults that had to provide daycare and help their children get online for a course if the broadband was working or the Wi-Fi was working. And there's a whole different issue about coverage, which is why we say the digital valley is something which we don't want anyone to forget about as we hopefully get to the end of this pandemic, which is how vulnerable we are. Ransomware, school districts, municipalities, they just don't understand or have the ability to upgrade. They did an amazing job in public meetings being held in a way that the higher attendance, because you didn't have to travel to the meeting. And so people were at home and they said, oh, there's a hearing tonight on this housing development. Let me watch and see what this is about. This is something that should stay with us. Not everybody wants to travel to that meeting at night after they've worked their job. But if they're home and eating dinner, they can take the laptop and be able to say, wait a minute, let me watch and let me listen. And we're hearing stories about that throughout the valley, right, about how attendance at public meetings has increased.
So there's a lot of companies in this space, right? There's broadband companies, there's the cable companies play a role here. And you said this, maybe this needs to be treated like a utility, similar to how electricity is treated. Maybe you could expand a little bit. What is Pattern's maybe policy recommendation here for the Valley, so that this isn't so that we don't have the digital divide long term?
So of the four areas that we point out, I'll just fess up to this is the weakest link. There is, for the workforce issue, Pattern can convene the 9 heads of economic development, the 9 heads of workforce. Housing, we know all the developers in the region. we can convene them. But when it comes to broadband and Wi-Fi and the transparency of the large providers, Spectrum, et cetera, this isn't so easy. And when they say you have service, my house in Rock Hill in Sullivan County has service. Yeah, except when it drops the Wi-Fi on a cell call, except when the broadband becomes either it drops or it's the image isn't very clear. And often the answer is, well, that's because there are too many people trying at the same time.
Right.
And we have to expand the cable width to allow more people in the broadband highway. Something I'm sure electricity folks have had to.
We can make an analogy to that. Sure.
You can make an analogy to that. There isn't a good group of people in the Hudson Valley putting their heads together to say, how do we fix this?
And not only, I mean, this certainly has implications, like you said, during the pandemic for education and people working from home. But I mean, the way you're describing it, there could be broader economic implications here if we want to grow and thrive as a region. If this is infrastructure, if we are so lacking in this infrastructure, as you say.
So, there are in the Westchester cities, New Rochelle comes to mind, where they pride themselves on hotspots throughout the city and the high percentage of people broadband. As you go north into the more rural parts of Sullivan, Dutchess, Greene, Columbia, parts of Orange, it gets spottier, the service. And figuring it out, I don't know if it's a generational idea when it comes to thinking about how we're going to provide it. And what I mean by that is, there's an old story I always heard about how they provided phone service in parts of Africa. So they were thinking, well, at the time, we put up telephone poles and then we have wires and then they connect eventually to a standalone phone. And then someone had the clever idea of saying, that doesn't make any sense. Let's give everyone a cell phone.
Right, so they just
Skip the generation of technology.
And there's a chance that could happen here, right? I mean, technology is evolving so quickly. What we think we need in terms of infrastructure could be very different.
Absolutely.
In just a few years. Something you have to pay attention to.
We do. And so it's like, that is one, because it is in that technology field that I was going to say, part of the reason housing was so disrupted is because the cost of lumber, the supply chain went up, was so expensive as we rebooted the economy. Fortunately, the cost of lumber has come back down, but the approval process is not exactly, there aren't communities that are like tripping over each other to say, I'm ready to build affordable and workforce housing. We need to get people to buy into that. The technology space, that could be one where it's a generational jump. There is Elon Musk and others that have the concept of surrounding the Earth with satellites to improve it. Right. And it may be that what we use now will be out of date in 5 years.
Right. So we're getting some interesting questions from Facebook, but I do want to make sure we touch on all the topics. So before I go to the questions from the audience, I want you to comment on the last focus area, and then we'll bring some of those back because they kind of touch on all the different topics. So the last area that Pattern focused on was Main Streets. That's a pretty tangible topic. We all know what Main Street looks like. I think you say that in your report. You know it when you see it. They're not all called Main Street, but you know it. I guess I would ask maybe a two-part question. What did Pattern find about our main streets? And, is there one or two that you think have gotten this right? And how can others in the Mid-Hudson Valley, build on that and learn from those best practices?
So I'm going to take a really unpopular position with some people. In my 15 years as the head of Pattern, and, for most of those years, we were located in the city of Newburgh. I looked across the river at the city of Beacon. And the Beacon that exists today that is an incredible opportunity for some to stroll, shop, eat out, didn't look that way 10 years ago, 15 years ago, where there were missing teeth, as we like to say when we're talking about Main Street. There were gaps of vacant lots. Yep. There are stores that are boarded up. Mm-hmm. Beacon is really the one that always comes to mind. Now, there are plenty of people who say, but we got gentrified, and therefore we could no longer afford to live there.
Not only that, I think you could say, too, maybe they got a few lucky breaks, right? Beacon gets DIA, Beacon has the train stop, and you can't, not every community is going to get those things that then drive people to the region. But there have to be other things. I mean, it's not just those things that made it work, right?
Well, no, but if you want to look for other examples of that, you go down to Warwick in Orange County. Main Street there is gorgeous, beautiful. Sullivan County, the hamlet of Hurleyville, the Center for Discovery is trying to actually curate a Main Street. There are strategies that exist. What we're trying to do is actually create a Main Street center for the Hudson Valley with some of the best community development people on our advisory board. We've been in contact with the state's Main Street program, but that program is a grant program. It doesn't really give you the best practices or technical assistance, and we want to occupy that space for the Hudson Valley. But we also want to do it and understand that the images of what happened during the pandemic, when you would look at Main Street and it was vacant, mm-hmm. There are many stores that never came back. And there are grant programs, but some of them simply could not make it because their margin was too small in terms of being able to, they needed a certain amount of dollars to flow in there, and they didn't survive the 20 months of the pandemic. The good news in this area is there is a high number of entrepreneurs, startups that are affecting business, and people have moved to say, I want to take a shot at doing this. I don't want to work for somebody, but I want my own little store on a Main Street. I want my opportunity to run a small business of 5 to 7 people, which may eventually need space on Main Street. And we want to encourage that, but we also want to encourage it also equitably. People of color should have that same opportunity to be able to start a business. And that's really what the basis of Main Street, Hudson Valley Main Street. My staff will always be angry that I get this wrong, but we're doing this. We're going to have a conference in December, and among some of the best people. We want to get back to where we were pre-pandemic. And it looked good, by the way, this summer. You would see people outside and walking about. The real test will come for a lot of these Main Streets. It's October 1st on Friday, and as we then go into the winter, are some of them so fragile that they don't make it to the next year?
So we just got a question, I think, that fits in nicely with what you're just talking about. So I'll read it to you and I'll let you comment. You were talking about tech startups and entrepreneurs locating on our main streets, and a question came in. Is there a way to incentivize more tech businesses to come here when most view upstate New York as heavily taxed and not as business friendly? So obviously Pattern can't change everything about what's wrong with those things, but maybe you could comment on that. And I know you're involved with the Mid-Hudson Regional Council, so you probably have some insights that others aren't exposed to. So if you could comment on that.
So this is never going to satisfy anybody, but one of my friends in economic development said, New York needs a bumper sticker that says, we're expensive, but we're worth it. The Hudson Valley, you're going to have to balance some of the costs of the regulations and taxation that New York State imposes upon an incredibly beautiful place to live. Now, you can't eat beautiful places, you know, it's expensive to live and work here. We need to be more creative on shared space. Remote work will enable people to not have to be paying for leased office space. I think there is an opportunity for the entrepreneur, the startup, the person that wants to do something on their own in a small business environment to do it and then see if it grows over a period of time. I don't think there's much in the short term that I could say to satisfy the questioner with regard to, is New York State expensive? And does that drive some larger businesses to choose not to locate here or to, you know, relocate? You know, they were here and they said, that's it. I can't pay what it costs to be here. But I'd like to think that there's a certain, we're trying to create a combination of where housing could be on Main Street so you could walk, that the workforce becomes, I don't know, I'm eternally optimistic about younger people. I have a 25-year-old son and a 23-year-old daughter that I am incredibly proud of how they persevered through the pandemic. And they are adaptive. They are not like the 65-year-old sitting next to you. They are willing to say, we have to look at what is being put in front of us and try to think differently about it. And that's very different than the sort of 50 and 60-year-old who is the head of a business that has grown up jaded by what the costs of New York are, to a younger person that might say, let me figure out how to navigate this. I like living here. It's nice. And, you know, New York City is a stone's throw away.
Right.
We see, you know, the tourism that has grown in the Hudson Valley shows us that there is this huge market of people that think there's a reason to visit us. How does that then translate into people that want to say, not only should we visit,
we should stay.
So
another question came in from Lavaz, and I think it's a good question because we haven't touched on it too much. I think it's touched on in Out of Alignment. Don't know if it was covered in the path forward, but here's the question. Did the report go into how different communities were impacted by the pandemic? What is the situation for our Hispanic communities, and how can things improve moving forward?
So let's talk about the Hispanic community, because the 2020 census has shown that the growth in the Latino community has been exponential. Cities like Newburgh is almost 60% Latino.
Do you know what that growth is from the 2010 census to the 20? Not to put you on the spot, but just to give people a sense of the change or the magnitude.
I will tell you that in my 15 years, I used to think the number was around 50. When I saw in the 2020 census, it's closer to 60.
That's big.
The village of Haverstraw in Rockland County, probably 50% Latino. So what does that mean? It means that the services for people, let's say in workforce or business,
education,
we could say that we don't have to provide it bilingually, but does that make sense? And it's not, you know, it's not like by the second generation, they speak English better than I do. Because they've assimilated and adopted. It's generally the first generation of immigrants to the region that maybe are constrained by their natural language. But what's more interesting to me is, having had our offices in Newburgh for so long, is that no one should ever think of the Latino or Hispanic community as monolithic. There are people from Honduras, Mexico, Peru, Puerto Rico, and they bring all different cultures with them. What that does is it translates into different kinds of restaurants, which makes visiting that community fun. But it also then means when we're thinking about bank loans or home loans or helping people out to get their first opportunity to run a business or own a home, that we need to also figure out, do we have someone who can communicate in that language? And the reason why it's worth it is that's what is happening in many communities in the Hudson Valley. So let's give them a chance the same way that generations ago the Irish and the German and the people of Jewish origin came to the United States and worked hard to do it. And but that's a different issue for another day. So
a couple other questions we got. They're similar, so I'll ask one or two of them. People were very focused on the job training and moving from education into the workforce. So one of the questions we got was, is there a role for organized labor in connecting youth with job and apprenticeship programs? Are you seeing any of that in the Mid-Hudson Valley? Other questions about what more can high schools do to get students ready for not just college but workforce? And you did touch on this, but it seems to be a topic that the audience is interested in. So I think let's talk a little bit more.
Okay, so the trades, and often those are unions. Some are non-union, but let's talk about the unions. They have apprenticeship programs, and as I learned, there are certain phrases in workforce that have dual meanings. So there's union apprentice programs, which are 5 years in length often. They regulate the number of people in, and they're doing it to ensure that their workforce earns a good wage over a long period of time. If there is an infrastructure bill out of Washington, we're going to need more laborers. And so will the unions then allow more people into their apprentice programs? Because the federal infrastructure money plays out over a 6-year period. So that should give the unions time to increase the number of people in their workforce. Now, for the high schools, apprentice may mean a different thing altogether. And there's apprentice programs that teach what we call soft skills. And this is something that employers are often rightly complaining about, which is that even the basics, showing up on time for work, staying there till the end. So we need programs at the high school level that do two things: teach soft skills and then create pipelines directly to an employment opportunity. I don't believe that it's enough for us to have career day or job fair.
Right, so how do we make those connections?
See, I'm thinking that the way to do that is that, Pine Bush High School is a really good example of what they do over the summer. I had a long conversation with the high school principal. It is a 3-week program in the summer, 300 kids. And I encourage anyone watching to, that's interested in this, to reach out to the principal there. He's only too happy to talk about it. Some people asked me, well, how did the union react? And basically, it's off contract. So he asked for volunteers. They pay $35 an hour to the teachers that are involved in this, but it's a 3-week immersive opportunity in 7 different academies. Law enforcement. You can go to YouTube and look up Pine Bush Academies, and it'll show you the different programs because they created YouTube videos so people would be involved in them. I think you need to get to young people not when they graduate and they have one session with their guidance counselor.
Right.
You want to be working with them. I said starting in 9th grade, and I've been corrected by some people
6th
in
grade,
workforce
7th grade.
saying, but not just a day. It's you want them, we need a regional internship program that enables young people to shadow people on a regular basis, not just one day. They need to be there for a long period. And even if they have a bad experience the first time, their parents or somebody else at school should say, maybe it was a bad experience. Maybe your supervisor didn't really know what they were getting into. Would you try it again? And so I think it's all hands on deck. And so, as I said earlier, it's BOCES, it's the community colleges, but we really do have to be geared much more to how are we going to fill these jobs that are not filled. By the way, I have no problem with the other 50% going to college and going to community college. We need people. We need it all.
Yeah. So, final question, and it's something you alluded to at the beginning. You couldn't put everything in this report. What are 1 or 2 topics or focus areas that you think the region needs to look at beyond what was laid out in this report as we move forward and kind of move to the post-pandemic life?
So, while this report, and we challenged our board to say, we can't do everything and do it well. So after much discussion, we settled upon workforce, housing, the digital valley, and what we could do to improve Main Street. So you're asking me what was left out from that discussion.
2.
Clearly it would be, and we've spent a lot of time on it in this discussion, education. And for me, I know how important it is for a young person to receive that certificate saying they graduated high school. I don't want to minimize that. But for someone who works for a regional think tank, I want to know the outcomes. I want to know what happened after they graduate. Did they go to a 4-year college, a 2-year college, or if they went into the workforce, what was their experience? If you can't measure it, how do you know that it's working? So the graduation rate in some high schools isn't the same as in others because if you had an opportunity to examine the outcomes. So education in particular, K through 12. And one more would have been climate change.
Okay.
There's no doubt that, I shouldn't say that. We live in a polarized world. There is always someone that doubts. There are people that want a vaccine, they don't want a vaccine. Given what you watch on the evening news, from the number of hurricanes to the fires on the West Coast to the flooding in New York City again, we thought what happened during Sandy was a once in 100-year experience, and yet there were the images. My favorite photo, not favorite, but just shocking, was people on a bus during Ida, I think.
Ida, yes.
Having to stand on the seats in a bus because the flooding had gotten to a point where they weren't going to make it. We really do have to pay much more attention, and because of the opportunity for infrastructure work, there is opportunity for good paying jobs. Even if you're not a true believer in climate change, then just do it because it creates a good job and let an engineer figure out the specs and how to make it work for the benefit of the valley. Look, Alana, I appreciate the time here. And our job is to be an honest broker and to try to move the dial. Being an honest broker means for us that we often tell people things they don't want to hear. Moving the dial is where we like to get in the, get dirty and help people figure out the solution. And we're always happy about doing that, but it takes the willingness of people in the Valley. I don't think anyone felt that the last 20 months was something to be happy about.
No.
And I think we have a chance to say, did we learn anything? And if we did, then let's do something different.
It's a good place to end. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. And I'd just like to let you know that tomorrow we will post this session on our Facebook page and on our YouTube page. Thank you and good evening.